Hello, everyone. This is New World Economics with the January 7th Russo-Ukrainian War update. Now, yesterday we talked about how there was supposed to be a ceasefire, and I believed that this would be honored in some kind of way, if not publicly, maybe possibly on the battlefield. It seems like there's some truth to that, but there's definitely still some fighting going on the battlefield. So very unfortunate, but we have a couple things to go over here. I will say that the reports of fighting on the battlefield does not look good, specifically for the Russian side. Now, of course, yesterday we talked about how the Ukrainians rejected the ceasefire deal that was offered by the Russians. It was non-conditional. It was basically just like, hey, 36 hours staying down for Christmas. The Ukrainian side rejected it. Shortly after that time period started, the Russian side was reporting HIMARS and M777 shelling in the areas of Donetsk, I believe. So, supposedly coming from the area of Avdiivka. So perhaps they decided that, oh, since, Ukraine, really isn't going to honor the ceasefire, they're going to keep firing at us, we're going to keep firing at them, and we're going to keep attacking. So, it's possible that they see it as like, well, they're not giving us a ceasefire, so we won't give them a ceasefire. But in reality, the Russians are the ones that made the big deal out of it. They made the big announcement that they, would not be, conducting any battlefield activities during this time period, regardless of the Ukrainians conducting shelling or anything like that. It probably would have been a good idea to not. I don't want to say not fight back, because if there's a fight breaking out, they have to fight back, but not to conduct offensive activities unless absolutely necessary, right? Just to focus on defense. Now, however, that's more of a political perspective on what's going on. In terms of a battlefield perspective, there are great advantages to be gained from fighting, yesterday and today, specifically based on these battlefield gains that happened early in the morning on the 6th in Solidar. So, the map here in Solidar, we're going to change it because it appears like there's a general consensus that, what's going on here is very different from what we have mapped out now. So if some of you guys will see, and I posted up a video yesterday where I geolocated Russian soldiers to this location right here. I posted up a video of the source material, and I also posted up, an image post where I tried to edit it and show you guys what was going on here. But basically, it looked like the filming was taking place from this catwalk here. You could see this catwalk bridge right here with two sets of tracks running under it. Of course, everything was very damaged and tore up. There was debris all over the tracks, so they were kind of tough to see. But in the overall pan of this area right here looks like kind of like an embankment. It's a dirt embankment. This is not like a courtyard. And then when you pan around to the roof, you'll see here you have this square-like roof structure with a downward slant on it. Well, when the camera pans around, this doesn't exist. It's just the framing. But the framing exactly matches up what you're seeing in the video. You're seeing like a triangle slanted down shape with a big square here. So basically, what I'm suggesting is artillery has completely demolished the roofs of this structure right here. So it's almost a complete confirmation of Russian troops in the middle of Solidar approaching the salt mine. So pretty significant advances for them, and that was reported yesterday. Now on the ISW's mapping report, they report that Russia has made pretty significant advances in the direction of Krasnopoliivka as well. Or this isn't necessarily like a claim by ISW. This is ISW saying that they have reports of Russian sources claiming this, right? So this is a disparity between what the Russians and Ukrainians are saying. So should that be true, that would move these lines pretty close up in this direction here. So very significant gains made by the Russians in these areas here, as well as in the area of Pidgorodny, we have some claims from Russian sources that they have captured this location. I still think this is premature. I've only seen the claim really one time, but it's certainly under threat, and it could happen any day. There's also Russian pushes in the direction of Krasnogora. I don't have any exact information on where they are. I don't think they've entered the town yet, so they're probably in these fields somewhere. We'll put the line right here because that puts one tree line in between the Russians and Krasnogora. It seems to make a little bit of sense. All right, so that is the sum total of the frontline information we've got here. So the rest of the video, I'm going to talk about this new military arms package that's being sent to Ukraine and what it means. It's actually a pretty significant package. They're saying that the U.S. is going to send $3 billion, and of course, like when they put these big numbers up, a lot of it's fluff because good portions and good chunks of that money actually goes directly back to the U.S. military for future procurement, and a big chunk of it also goes to NATO, like especially Eastern European NATO countries, like say Slovakia, Poland, Lithuania, the Baltic states, so on, so they could buy replacements for the vehicles that we've convinced them to send to Ukraine. So there's some new stuff that they're talking about sending here. And first, I want to go over like the different types of like armored vehicles and tanks. So of course you have infantry fighting vehicles, right? So that is basically what once would have been called an armored personnel carrier. I guess like we don't really call them that anymore. The M113, I believe, when it first came out, was called an armored personnel carrier. But basically what it does is it carries an infantry squad around the battlefield. So it turns an infantry squad mobile, so they can move around the battlefield rather quickly, and it provides armored protection from small arms and artillery, and not direct artillery hits. We're talking about like artillery splashing down nearby that sends shrapnel in every direction. So they're lightly armored. They just basically prevent like AKs and shrapnel from getting through, so it protects the guys. So this is very, very important equipment for mechanized infantry, right? It drastically increases their survivability. So on top of that, you also have your tanks, and really I guess you can look at it as if there's three, maybe four different types of tanks. So you have your traditional tank, which both sides seem to have large numbers of, your T-64s, T-72s. This is your main battle tank. This is kind of an all-purpose vehicle. If you were to look at this in comparison to, say, like fighters, this is a fighter bomber, right? Like it plays both roles. It can go after tanks. It can also go after infantry and other targets. Its primary focus actually is, I guess you'd say, like all vehicle. Like, tanks are really designed to destroy other moving targets, right? So a step up from that, you have tank destroyers, which are specifically designed to destroy other tanks, right? So not necessarily good against infantry, and other things, but they're specifically designed to only seek out and destroy other tanks on the battlefield. And then you go a step below the main battle tank, and then you have what you call assault guns. So assault guns, there's very few modern pieces of military equipment that can actually be considered an assault gun. I guess you could say it was thought that like they weren't really needed anymore. They were used a lot during World War II, especially by the German army, and the purpose of these is their infantry support anti-infantry tanks, I guess you could say. So they're kind of ish lightly armored, armored to the point to where infantry has some issues destroying them, but they have the perfect armaments to go after infantry. So basically, they're not firing, you know, anti-tank penetrating rounds out of their gun. They're firing more or less like high explosive rounds that cause a lot of shrapnel and make a big boom, right? So they're not, firing a lot of penetrating rounds, perhaps like a bigger shell, just with more explosive power. Not really sure. I'm not particularly like an expert on this thing, but I do know that there's been a big need for this type of equipment on the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war so far. Both sides have kind of discovered this. Both sides are kind of just using main battle tanks for this purpose. But the issue with using main battle tanks for this purpose is an assault gun typically has not a high fire rate, but a high demand for the amount of fire that needs to be put out of it. So throughout the day, potentially hundreds of shells. And doing this with main battle tanks wears out the barrels really fast. They weren't really designed for this kind of purpose. They were designed maybe to go through a full load of shells, which would be like 24 to 32 shells, I think, in an autoloader. Maybe once or maybe twice a day to fire that many shells. But there's way more shells being fired than that out of especially some of these Russian tanks. The Russians are even using them as indirect artillery fire. And then the last type of tank, I guess you could say, it's not really a tank, but would be self-propelled artillery. So the mobile guns that we've seen, a lot of times are built on a tank chassis. A lot of people can mistake them for a tank. They look like a tank, but it's basically artillery on a tank chassis. And those don't see the absolute front line very often unless the front line's changing very quickly. All right, so the latest report is that Western countries are gathering together to send a bunch of different armored vehicles to Ukraine. This is definitely a sign that for the foreseeable future, the West will be equipping, either new Ukrainian brigades or re-equipping brigades that are like sorely lacking in equipment. So, the West can potentially do this for another year. So it kind of shows that if Russia wants to win this thing, they need to deal some kind of lull to prevent a lot of these units from getting to the front. But in terms of IFVs, there's a shipment of Kirpy armored vehicles that has just showed up in Ukraine, about 50 of those, and they're not really IFVs. I guess you'd say they're like more like armored trucks. And then you have 140 U.S. Humvees that are being shipped over, and then there is a shipment of Marder infantry fighting vehicles, and this is a German APC that is being promised to Ukraine. This hasn't been sent so far, but I will say that I have very little confidence that this vehicle will be highly effective on the front line. And the reason for that is, it's a very good vehicle on paper, but I've read some recent articles that suggest that they suffer from the same issues that, say, the PZH 2000 German self-propelled howitzers suffer from, and they're just not intended for high-intensity operation on the battlefield. They break down all the time, constantly. They're hardly even considered reliable at this point. And the issue with this one, I was reading a recent article about the German army, which was supposed to participate in a NATO exercise sometime in the last year. And they showed up, and it was something like 16 out of 18 of the Marder IFVs that were supposed to participate in the exercise. They couldn't even get them started. Like or they had like some other problems. Like they were deemed inoperable. So this kind of turned into a big scandal because this hit the news that Germany can't even show up with working equipment to an exercise. And the German defense minister, which I think is Annalena Baerbock, Christine Lambrecht, I'm sorry Annalena, but Christine Lambrecht, found out about this and immediately launched an investigation to find out who leaked the information. So, rather than trying to fix the problem, but Germany only has a relatively small number of these compared to what's being used in Ukraine right now. Only I believe somewhere around 200 units of this, and they're probably not going to be willing to send all of them to Ukraine. So 40 of these is probably the maximum amount that they will send to Ukraine. On top of that, the next infantry fighting vehicle is the M2 or M3 Bradley, which is a U.S. Not necessarily a light tank, but it has a lot of different functions. This vehicle is, has proved reliable, but at the same time, I have questions about its design and how well it will perform in Ukraine. For example, if you were to look at it, it's actually the predecessor to the M113 armored personnel carrier, which has not done well in Ukraine at all. I mean, of course, it has some major differences. This actually has a turret with an armament. It appears to have some explosive reactive armor, which is certainly an upgrade, but I think this vehicle ticks a lot of boxes in terms of like what it can do. It has a chain gun, a 25 millimeter chain gun, tow anti-tank missiles, an M240 machine gun, which I believe is coaxially mounted on the vehicle. So, it has some capabilities. Not to mention it can carry a 6-man infantry squad, so it can bring a fully loaded one of these can bring some firepower to the battlefield. However, I'm unsure of its overall design and shape. It doesn't seem to me like these big bulky vehicles are very good at deflecting. I guess you can say deflecting like other tank rounds or like perhaps like missiles and stuff. You see a lot of like newer tank designs are pretty sleek. They have a lot of angles on them that are meant to deflect rounds off of them. So you have it's very interesting. This was first developed by the Soviets in World War II. Instead of having like a flat piece of 2-inch thick armor, you can angle the armor by 45 degrees and increase the thickness of that armor by 60%, just based on the angle. On top of that, by changing the angle of it, it was far more likely for rounds just to bounce off the tank. And that's basically the story of like the T-34, right? The T-34 tank. Well, these tanks, or these light infantry fighting vehicles are a lot more boxy. And potentially a death trap for whoever's inside of them. And that's what the M113 was considered to be. I don't believe that very many of these Bradleys have ever been destroyed, really. I mean, of course, they were deployed in the Iraq wars, and there's probably a few of them that have been destroyed, but they didn't go through like the poor combat trials that the M113 went through. Like basically, I guess what I'm saying is it's like the enemies that these were used to fight against were so inferior that they did pretty well. But I question how well they'll do on the battlefield against modern weapons. And I'm sure they'll perform way better than M113s and perhaps even like BMP-1s and stuff, but based on the fact they have explosive reactive armor and a number of things. But the latest report is the U.S. is going to send 50 of these, of which we have over 2,000 in storage, and it's a vehicle that's going through its retirement phase. So potentially as they get replaced, or as procurement for new vehicles goes in and production on those vehicles start, the U.S. would be more and more willing to send these. The first batch is 50. The Biden administration will probably wait on the public reaction for that. And if the public isn't too upset about it, they'll start sending 100, in different intervals. So the next is a French light tank, and this is what you would put in technically it's a reconnaissance vehicle, but you would put it in the tank destroyer category. Like that's what the turret on this vehicle is intended for. It's intended to get around the battlefield very quickly, to advance behind enemy lines very quickly. It's basically a tank turret put on an IFV body to give it speed. They're not very resilient at all. I'm not saying they break down a lot, but there's very light armor on these. And should it actually come up against a tank, like in a one-on-one, like say even like a T-64, T-72, T-72 is probably going to win. The advantages in this would be kind of like hit and run, like stealth, like quickly, advance to a tree line, target a tank without being seen, take a shot at it, and then get the hell out of there before it fires back. Like that's what this is used for, which is probably right up Ukraine's alley for like some of their advanced like sabotage and DRG units. This could be a very useful piece of equipment. And I believe France is sending a number of these. I'm not exactly sure how many. I know it's less than 50. And the last thing is this Paladin, which this is an older. I believe an older, or this is one of the most recent. I believe this is probably being replaced. I think, which typically it says in the description what it's being replaced with, but I haven't read this all in its entirely. But 1991, so a little bit older model self-propelled artillery, fires 155 millimeter rounds. This is combat tested. Is probably more resilient on the battlefield than Polish Crabs and German PZH 2000s. Those two guns tend to break down all the time. They're not necessarily reliable. This one is probably slightly more reliable. However, it still hasn't been tested in high intensity combat in the same way that the Russian and Ukrainian Metzas and Acacia howitzers are. They're definitely at a lower level technologically, but they're built to take a beating and basically shoot an absolute shit ton of rounds. But this is definitely a good piece of equipment. There's going to be 18 of them sent to Ukraine, and certainly something they can put to good use. Well, the last thing I would say, so that basically covers, tanks, IFVs, self-propelled artillery, or I guess, not necessarily tanks, but IFVs, self-propelled artillery, and tank destroyers. I will say that there is potentially a assault gun that could be sent to Ukraine, and that would be the M1128 Striker. So like the M1 or the M2, M3 Bradley, this is in the process of being replaced in the U.S. military. They actually had some problems with it. It didn't work the way they wanted it to. So, they're looking to, whatever it was, the combat role that they wanted them to have. Like there were some general issues with these things in terms of like reliability and breaking down, not necessarily in like the engine or the vehicle itself, but different components on the vehicle didn't always work. And over a couple years they managed to fix a lot of these things, but it just didn't perform in combat the way that they wanted it to. However, that was a different kind of combat, and now that there's a high need for an assault gun on the battlefield, it's likely that the Ukrainians could can make good use of this. So there's a chance that they could talk the U.S. into sending something like this. Not necessarily in this next package, but sometime in 2023, especially if the U.S. makes a lot of progress on its new light tank coming out. It's going to replace a lot of stuff. It is what it is. It's just basically an IFV, or it's a kind of like a BTR, like similar to the Russian BTR with a large tank turret on the top of it. It doesn't have explosive reactive armor. It's probably actually pretty lightly armored. So survivability for these things on the front line would probably be kind of low, but doesn't mean it can't be put to good use. All right, guys. So other than that, the U.S. is talking about sending some more Patriot missile systems, a lot of ammunition for artillery and stuff. It looks like the U.S. is managing to scrape up the necessarily 155 millimeter and 120 millimeter artillery rounds needed to keep Ukraine in the fight, at least for a couple more months. And that's not necessarily how many shells they're sending. Right now, it looks like they're sending probably about a month's supply at a time, but the U.S. probably does have several months of 155 and 120 millimeter shells to send. So that's all I got for you guys today. I feel like I'm missing something. Oh yeah, so the one thing, and I probably should have covered this in the beginning, which kind of makes all this like slightly misleading. I meant to cover it when the topic came up, but there has been a lull in the fighting, or at least reported from the Ukrainian side, for the last 10 hours. So if you look at the entire front line, at all the assault actions, everything that the Ukrainians claim they repelled was 10 hours ago. All the artillery shelling was 10 hours ago, or more. So, that puts the timing, like the real timing of a potential ceasefire around, 10 a.m. this morning in Ukraine. So hopefully that keeps up, at least for the next 5 hours or so. So, if we didn't get a 36-hour ceasefire, hopefully we're getting, a 20-hour ceasefire or something like that. All right, guys, that's it for me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.